Let's move in now to a profound question that we've received recently from a viewer. We're going to begin with, what about Israel's war? And here's the question we received from Martin B. in Spokane, Washington. Martin says, I appreciate your teachings and wanted to ask you to share your views on the war in Israel. Thanks in advance, Martin B. So the question here is, share your views on the war on Israel in light of Jesus' nonviolent love of friends and enemies. So first of all, I want to say to Martin, thank you for reaching out with a thoughtful question. And your question touches on a deeply complex and challenging and sensitive issue. And as Christians, of course, we're called to embody and advocate for the nonviolent love of Jesus Christ. And so let's make a few observations here. Obviously, there is a war going on in Israel, and that's occurring right now as we speak. Thousands of people are dying. Most of them are civilians. So the question becomes, as Christians, do we support the Jewish state in its efforts to fight its enemies with homicidal violence? First of all, let's realize that Jesus came specifically to Israel. Israel had a unique encounter. Israel holds a distinct place in history as the nation that encountered Jesus Christ in the flesh. Israel was the only nation to host Jesus Christ. It was the only nation to see him in the flesh and to hear his words with their own ears. It was the Hebrew nation that hosted Jesus Christ. And this unique experience of hearing his teachings firsthand carries profound implications for understanding his message of nonviolence. Now, remember, Jesus' commands were spoken and made to Israel. So Jesus, while he was born a Jew, directed his teachings specifically to the Jewish people. And he, of course, intended those teachings and those commands to be heeded and shared with the Gentiles. And that's what we were talking about earlier in Matthew 28, where we have our Great Commission. But the commands were specifically given to the Jewish people. So he comes and he specifically tells Jews to love their enemies. All of the Sermon on the Mount, remember, is not delivered to people living in Brazil, although it is intended for them. It is intended to be heeded and then shared with those living in Brazil. Jesus did not come and tell all of these words to people living in South America, North America, Asia, or Africa, right? He comes right to Israel and he shares these words with Jews. And then they are told to share those words with us, but they come to the Jew first. The Jews hear the message first. Love your enemies. They hear it first. So we have to keep that in mind before we answer the question of how Christians are to respond to Israel's war. We have to remember that Jesus commanded Israel to love its enemies. Among the teachings that Jesus imparted was a clear directive to love our enemies and renounce violence. Jesus told the Jew to love their enemy and to put away their swords. So this command was given directly to the Jewish people. They were commanded to love their enemies. Now you say, well, Jesus is talking to me, to telling me to love my enemies. He told you to love your enemies through the Jewish people. Now, there were some ancient consequences of disobedience to Jesus. The rejection of Jesus' message to nonviolence had dire consequences historically. The rejection of Jesus' message to nonviolently love their enemies led to the murder of Jesus Christ. It led to his crucifixion. Because instead of loving their enemies, instead of displaying love towards Jesus and returning his love with their own love, they instead murdered him. They crucified him. Not only did their rejection of Jesus' message of nonviolence lead to their murder of Jesus, but it also led to significant suffering for them as a people. It led to the destruction of their temple. It led to the loss of the nation in 70 AD and onwards. So this serves as a sobering reminder of the cost of ignoring the path of peace. That what if the Jewish nation, when Jesus came, actually said, yes, we agree with you. We want to non-violently love our enemies. Would Rome have come in and smashed them to the ground? Rome was a pretty busy empire. They didn't have time to be going and picking fights with their different provinces. They preferred peace with them because it was how they made money. But the Jews hated their enemies, and they hated Rome. And they rose up against them, and Rome responded. There are ancient consequences for disobedience to Jesus' teachings on nonviolence. Now we turn to the modern state of Israel. The establishment of modern Israel in 1948 was achieved through violent conflict, homicidal violence, and enemy hatred. The establishment of modern Israel in 1948 came through the sword. And that stands in polar opposition to the teachings of Jesus Christ on nonviolence. So modern Israel lives by the sword. And we know what Jesus says about those who live by the sword, what's going to happen to them. The Bible tells us they're going to die by the sword. These are Jesus' own words. So we have ancient consequences of disobedience. How about modern consequences of disobedience? Well, there's a cost to the conflict. What is modern Israel doing today? As we said, it's living by the sword. The ongoing conflict with Hamas underscores a painful reality, the heavy toll of war, particularly on the most vulnerable. Since the war began with Hamas on October 7th, 2023, as of this date, approximately 31,000 Palestinians have died, and more than 72,000 Palestinians have been wounded. The majority of the victims of both the dead and the wounded have been women and children. Now, these numbers do not just represent a humanitarian crisis. They challenge us to reconsider the efficacy and morality of using homicidal violence to solve conflict. There have been modern consequences of disobedience to Jesus' call to nonviolent love of friends and enemies. Israel is still living by the sword. Who is going to tell Israel the truth? How should Christians respond? When this war broke out with Israel, I told some Christian friends of mine that this was deeply grieving to me because I realized that this was going to be potentially a very nasty, long, drawn-out war, and that it would be completely contrary to Jesus' will. Jesus does not have a will for Jews or Africans or Americans or Germans or Japanese to kill their enemies. That is not Jesus' will. And so when we consider the conflict in Israel, and we consider any conflict for that matter, we must ask ourselves, how can we, as followers of Jesus Christ, who non-violently loved his friends and enemies and laid down his life and told us to follow him, how can we, as Christians and followers of that master, that non-violent master, how can we encourage actions that stand in stark opposition to his teachings? How can we encourage or equip individuals to harm their enemies, thereby contradicting the message of love and peace that Jesus embodied? I mean, to me, this contradiction goes beyond mere inconsistency. It verges on antithetical to Christ's teachings. In essence, I would say that we could see it as anti-Christ. That is, to propagate actions and attitudes diametrically opposed to the essence of who Jesus is and what he taught. And yet the American church here today, in 2024, much of the evangelical church, stands side by side with Jews as they live by the sword, and encourages them and equips them and finances them to kill their enemies. As Christians, I would suggest to you that our role is not to fan the flames of conflict, but rather to be peacemakers and to encourage all, including our Jewish brothers and sisters, towards a path of peace and reconciliation. This means advocating for and practicing nonviolent love as Jesus did. It means remembering his call to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us, not as a sign of weakness, but as the ultimate demonstration of strength and faith. Now, it's important for us to approach this topic with humility and with a deep sense of compassion for all involved. The pain and the suffering on all sides of this conflict are real and they're profound. It's heartbreaking to see what's happening, in this part of the world. And yet it is precisely in these moments of deep division and suffering that the teachings of Jesus on nonviolence and love for one's enemies become most relevant and most needed. In essence, to follow Jesus and to be truly Christian means to champion nonviolent love in all situations, even the most difficult ones. Perhaps even especially the most difficult ones. It's a call to live out our faith in ways that challenge the status quo and invite us to a deeper, more profound love for all of humanity. So, what about Israel's war? Israel should lay the sword down and follow Jesus. That is what Jesus calls you to do. It's what he calls me to do. And it's what he's calling every citizen of the modern state of Israel to do. There are not two masters. There are not some who are following Moses. There is no higher law than Jesus' law. Moses is not side by side with Jesus. He is not standing shoulder to shoulder with Jesus. Jesus stands alone. He is greater than Moses. He is the supreme interpreter of the Mosaic law. And all, including Jews, must follow Jesus. And they must follow his laws. He does not have a separate set of laws for different people. He has one law, and it's the law of love. And the Jew must follow the same law that the American or the South African must follow. They must follow Jesus' law. There are not two peoples of God. There is one people of God. He, in fact, died to destroy the hostility that stood between us, to create out of the two one new man, as Paul tells us. There is neither Jew nor Gentile today. There is one new man, and he died so that that wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles, that hatred, would be destroyed. But yet some would still have us believe today that there are two peoples of God. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is one people of God, and Jesus Christ is their Lord. We reject Jesus or we accept Jesus, but there are not two or three different ways. Now, Jesus' message to love our enemies and lay down our swords is as radical today as it was 2 millennia ago. No one wanted a nonviolent Messiah 2,000 years ago, and no one wants a nonviolent Messiah today. But as Christians, we have a profound responsibility of carrying Christ's commands to a world torn by conflict. And so what about Israel's war? Israel needs to follow Jesus. We don't make the rules. We're just the messengers.